All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. My name is René Provost, and I'm a professor here in the Faculty of Law and the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. So before we start with our session, I'm going to cede the floor to my colleague Vrinda Narain, who has I think a message she wants to share with us. So Vrinda.
Thank you, René. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to my quick message. I'm really extremely fortunate to have this opportunity to share with you some news about actually a colleague and a friend of mine who has just been arrested in Iran, Professor Homa Hudvar, who teaches anthropology at Concordia University. She was in Iran doing some field work, and she was arrested in March and released on bail. On Monday, this Monday, the 6th of June, she was arrested and imprisoned again in Evin prison, which some of you might be familiar with. So this is just an opportunity for me to share with you that there really are scholars at risk, even now as we speak, and I urge you to take some time to look at the petitions that's on the Scholars at Risk website as well, and to spread the news, because at this point all we can do is hope that there's going to be this big publicity campaign and awareness campaign, because as you know, Canada doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran, which makes it all the more difficult to conduct any negotiations. We had been conducting negotiations so-called underground, because we didn't want the case to go public in case it adversely affected her chances of actually being released. Unfortunately, all those chances failed. She now no longer has contact with her own lawyer, and of course no contact with her friends and family outside of Tehran. So this is a great opportunity to be able to share her story and to share it widely. Thank you.
All right. So this afternoon's panel is on unfair prosecutions, which is typically related to free speech violation, although as Homa Hudvar's story illustrates, not necessarily, because she's not known to have actually said anything yet that is so objectionable. But typically it relates to freedom of expression or free speech, which is a concept which is interpreted quite variably in different places, with the United States as probably the jurisdiction which has the most extensive protection of free speech. Very, very little can be done to limit any kind of speech under US constitutional law. And then there is a spectrum, with Canada being somewhat more restrictive, with some limitations for hate speech, to other countries, places like Singapore, which have free speech, but where libel laws have been used for a long time to silence opponents, to finally places like Iran, where there is relatively little free speech to be had if there is political content to it. Now, the very fact that there is a spectrum means that there is a discussion as to what are the acceptable limits to freedom of expression. And the answer that no limit is the only acceptable position, that position is not universally shared, and not shared necessarily by people who have a commitment to freedom of expression and to the full defense of human rights, because speech can be used to harm as well. And so there are legitimate bases on which restrictions can be imposed. I mentioned hate speech. We can think about incitement to terrorism, and there are other types of limitations that are thought to be legitimate. The reality of that is that this discussion creates a fig leaf that many regimes use to hide the suppression of political speech that they find objectionable, including those carried out by scholars. So we have three speakers today, this afternoon, that will each address the issue of wrongful prosecution in relation to scholars. And I just wanted to relay to you what questions they were asked to address, just so that you know where they come from. So what specific laws pose the greatest opportunity for misapplication in your country of focus? How are these laws impacting the academic community? Are prosecution active and ongoing, or has the specter of prosecution created a culture of self-censorship in academia? Does the status of academic confer any relative immunity from prosecution, or alternatively result in increased scrutiny? Do you see areas where the international community, and specifically the Scholars at Risk Network, can engage with these issues and help address these wrongful prosecutions? In addition to advocacy for individuals targeted for prosecution, do you see opportunities for the international community to push for more systemic changes? So we have three speakers, as I mentioned, and I will just briefly introduce them, say a few words about each right now so that I don't have to stand up here again in between them. So the first will be Tyrell Haberkorn, who is a fellow and a senior lecturer on political and social change at the Australian National University. She works on state violence, human rights, and dissident cultural politics in Thailand, has published a couple of books on the topic. Interestingly enough, she's also active in poetry, and she is the one non-lawyers that we've allowed on our panel today. The second speaker will be Azmi Sharom, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Malaya, who was trained in the UK, obtaining his PhD from SOAS in London, teaches in private international law, environmental law, and human rights, and is head of the Human Rights Research Group at the Faculty of Law at his university. He was recently, a couple of years ago, charged with sedition for giving an opinion on the constitutionality of a question in his state, charges which were later dropped. And he mentions that he'd rather be spending his time watching football. And I'm going to bet that he's going to support England in the forthcoming Euro. Okay, we'll talk about that in the question period then. All right, then Bertan Tokuzlu is a professor at Istanbul Bilgi University in Turkey. Was educated in Turkey, Sweden, and has been working on refugee law issues. So he focuses on international protection law, constitutional law, human rights, and European law. So each speaker will intervene in turn, and we will hold the questions and discussion until after each of the three speakers has intervened, so that we can have a general conversation in which everyone can intervene. All right, so we start with Tyrell.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about legal repression and other forms of repression in Thailand during the last 2 years. And I'll start by talking about the broad context, and then I'll talk about 3 relevant laws and the numbers of cases that have arisen under them, and then talk in particular about a case involving, at this point, 2 university lecturers who will soon find out if the complaint against them is going to become a prosecution or not. So first of all, it's important to always keep in mind that the political context in Thailand over the last 10 years has been framed by 2 coups, the first on the 19th of September 2006, and the second on the 22nd of May 2014. In between, there was a period of a combination of, I would say, many illegitimate governments, but also actually a tremendous amount of progressive activism, writing, art, and culture, particularly during the later part of those years in between the coups. With this last coup in 2014, which was led by a junta calling itself the National Council for Peace and Order, immediately within the first day after the coup, it was clear that a return to civilian government, legitimate or illegitimate, was not going to happen anytime soon. And in fact, drawing on a playbook largely pulling from laws from both dictatorships in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as well as developing their own innovations. They've systematically tried to shut down many avenues of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. In particular, there are 3 laws that are relevant to think about. 2 of them are from the existing criminal code, so they're not new, but they've been used very actively during the past 2 years. The first is Article 112, or the law that defines and criminalizes the alleged crime of lèse-majesty, which is that any action deemed to defame, defame, insult, or threaten the king, queen, heir apparent, or regent can result in a prison term of 3 to 15 years per count. So counts can be decided in various ways by prosecutors and judges. The next is Article 116 of the Criminal Code, which is a catch-all law that covers sedition. And that's been used since the coup to target critics of the regime. And then the next is, I actually sort of hesitate to call it law. There are 2 announcements. One's an announcement and the other is an order issued by the junta, which criminalizes any public gathering of 5 or more persons. The other key piece of information is that since the coup, the military court is being used to process civilians for crimes against the crown and state for the first time since the late 1970s. So what's the picture of how many people are being affected by these laws, and what do they look like? So first of all, I want to note that these numbers are all absolute minimum numbers. These are cases that human rights activists and journalists know about, so the actual numbers may be higher. So the first is actually not connected to any of these laws, but is connected to people who have been summoned to report themselves to the junta, or the military has visited them at their homes, which is possible. It was first possible under martial law, and now it's possible under coup order. It's 926 people. There have been 527 people who have been arrested under the coup regime. 68 of those have been arrested and prosecuted for lèse-majesty. 47 have been arrested and prosecuted for sedition. And then 85 have been arrested and prosecuted for assembly of 5 or more persons. In terms of how these laws affect the scholarly and student community, with lèse-majesty, there's less than one handful of scholars and students who've been targeted under this law thus far. That could change, but the vast majority of people who are prosecuted for lèse-majesty are people without cultural, social, and political capital. So villagers, factory workers, other activists, but so far not academics and scholars. A large number of those who are being prosecuted for sedition, a large number of those are student activists. That's one of the laws that the junta is trying to use to stop people from being active. So far, it hasn't worked, luckily. The case that I want to devote more attention to is a case of violation of the junta's prohibition against gatherings of 5 or more persons. And with all of these laws, application is incredibly selective and arbitrary. So there are some people who carry out protests who are not arrested, but in essence, one doesn't know until the police or military show up or do not show up. And in one of these cases, it took place last October, and in mid-October, the head of the junta and Prime Minister, General Prayut, had made a comment in the press that academics were teaching people to question authority a little too much. And a group of scholars who were meeting for a workshop on rural transformation in Chiang Mai issued a statement of less than 1 page at the end of their conference. There were 8 of them who sat in a hotel meeting room and issued a statement. And I'd like to read the final paragraph of their statement so you have a sense of what in fact is criminalized. So they wrote and said, "We, teachers from various educational institutions, share the view that in order to lead Thai society between conflict to long-term peace, equality, and fairness, The basic principles that are necessary are as follows. We must build a society that has the ability to be open-minded to different opinions. We must have a process of resolving problems and conflicts that is just and transparent. We must have a system of laws and a judicial process that is neutral and can be audited. A society with these characteristics is one that is governed in a free and democratic fashion and has a constitution that facilitates the creation of fairness and guarantees for the rights and liberties of the people. It is the explicit duty of educational institutions at every level to build this kind of democratic society. It is not the role of educational institutions to acquiesce to the intimidation of power that will only lead Thai society to sink into a state in which knowledge is eclipsed and we are unable to adapt to the present and future world. I imagine that many people in this room would be quite happy to stand behind that statement. But the military disagreed, and in mid-November, they were informed that the 8 academics were informed that a complaint had been filed against them and that they were going to be investigated for violating the junta's order prohibiting public assemblies. What then happened is that an investigation was carried out by the police. And the case was then forwarded to the military prosecutor at the end of March. And on the 6th of July, they will appear in the military court to hear the order of whether or not they're going to be prosecuted or not. If they are prosecuted and convicted, they could face imprisonment of up to 1 year, as well as being stripped of their position as university lecturers, so of their position as civil servants. So just to, by way of conclusion, to come back to what do these prosecutions, as well as many of the non-judicial mechanisms being used to surveil and repress academics in Thailand mean. So first of all, the use of the 3 laws that I mentioned is paired with a number of other forms of repression, including the summons that I mentioned, the revocation of passports, for some critics, restrictions on travel for others, many different kinds of threats, many kinds of harassment, not only the military or police showing up at one's house, but also showing up at one's faculty, or deans who are often complicit because many university rectors are very close to the junta, so a visit from the dean with questions about one's research or other activities. Other forms of intimidation and surveillance, which have tremendous effects on people's lives and the atmosphere inside the university. In response to the question about self-censorship, people may have heard that there was a case of a taxi driver who actually was recently released from prison, but he was prosecuted for lèse-majesté on the basis of a conversation he had with a passenger in his taxi. And a former student of mine finished his PhD and began teaching several months after the coup. And I asked him how his new job was going and what it was like. And he laughed and he said, the first piece of advice that his department chair gave him was to watch what he said in the classroom, because who knows if the students were recording what he was saying, and then he would be prosecuted. I just want to point out he doesn't teach law or political science, he teaches 19th century history. So that's to give you an idea of what self-censorship looks like. And I think, actually, I will end there.
Okay. Thank you. Right. Well.
Okay.
We're not meant to be 4 on this particular stage.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being patient and allowing me to stand up, because if I sit down, I'll fall asleep. I had a rather good lunch. So we were given a list of questions to answer, which was really helpful because God knows I'm in no state to create a proper paper. So I'll just answer these questions first. What are the specific laws in Malaysia which could be used to suppress academics? Oh, good Lord, where do I start? The first one, which I can think of immediately, and I'm really worried because I'm being filmed here, is that there's been a policy decision by the Immigration Department that anyone who belittles the government overseas will have their passports revoked. So please excuse me when I tell you that my government is the best in the world, and really no one can hold a torch to us. We're just brilliant. Hurrah. So already, I come overseas. I was so worried at immigration. I thought I might be blacklisted, but fortunately, I think they would rather I leave and never come back. Another law which can be used against us is the University and University Colleges Act, which is really more applicable to students, but also applies to academics, because we're not supposed to criticize university policies outside of our universities. So, just as my government is the best in the world, my university is the best in the world, and they can do no wrong. The penal code has been amended. That's our criminal law. The penal code has been amended, and it now includes, an offense has been included in 2012, which says it is a crime punishable by 20 years in prison if one were to do anything which was to threaten parliamentary democracy. Now, what on earth does that mean? So far, those who have been investigated under this particular section under the penal code have threatened parliamentary democracy by requesting that the Prime Minister resign and questioning corruption within government. So if that amounts to threatening parliamentary democracy, God help us all. This one I like. This next law I do like. It's called, it's a real tongue twister, say this 5 times quickly, the Statutory Bodies Discipline and Surcharge Act. Now this law applies to public universities because we are statutory bodies. We are made by statute, so it applies to us. It applies to public university lecturers like myself. And under the discipline section, there's this wonderful, wonderful little passage which says that if any of us, employees of statutory bodies, were to criticize, we are not allowed to criticize government policy. That is an offense. But here's the best bit. If we want to praise government policy, we've got to get permission first. Right? It's the only law I am aware of in the world where a spot of brown-nosing requires permission from the government. I want to praise you, sir. Can I, please? So it's kind of odd. Now, the last law which can be used against us and has been used against us, and forgive my ego, has been used against me, is the Sedition Act. Now, this is a remnant from the British colonial powers. Thank you very much, Your Majesty. And basically, it says that if we were to raise disaffection against the royal families, and we have plenty. We have 9 royal families. Most of the royal families in the world are actually in Malaysia. The government or the administration of justice, that is sedition. And that's exactly what happened to me. And at the risk of boring all of you, I'll briefly tell you what happened. I was called up one afternoon by a newspaper reporter, and he asked me to give an opinion with regards to a particular constitutional crisis in one of our states. And what happened in this state was that the ruling party of the state had lost confidence in their chief minister, and they wanted him gone. Right? Very simple. Now, but he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go. So the reporter asked me, what can we do? Can we follow the example a few years earlier, which occurred in another state? Now, what happened in this earlier example? In the earlier example, same thing. The chief minister lost the confidence of the House, and they wanted to get rid of him, and he didn't want to go. And so what the Legislative Assembly persons did was a bunch of them went to the Sultan, and they said, Your Majesty, we don't want this chap anymore. Can you appoint someone new? And the Sultan did just that. And so the reporter was asking me, could we use that precedence in the present-day case? And I said, no. I said, you shouldn't, because in my point of view, what happened earlier was legally wrong. Because if you want to have a vote of no confidence, then you have to do it in the House. A vote of no confidence is a term of art. It has to be done properly in the Legislative Assembly. You can't do it in secret. Now, what I said was actually based on a case decided in my country in the 1960s. And what I said was also based on my standing as a law lecturer. And for that, I was charged with sedition. It's kind of odd. You know, I said far, far worse things in the past, but they had to choose that particular thing. So that was in September 2014, and earlier this year, they dropped the charges because, partly because I think of pressure from the international community as well as domestically, and partly because I think they realized it was a bloody stupid case in the first place. Now, are prosecutions active? Yes. Well, you know, what happened to me was pretty much active. Other colleagues have also been pressured. I have a colleague in the Islamic International University, Professor Aziz Bari, who wasn't even charged. He was merely investigated for sedition, but his university decided to basically terminate his employment. It was a constructive dismissal. Another colleague in my university, Dr. Koo Ying Hui, wrote an article on an online news portal which criticized the police, and lo and behold, the police came and they questioned her and so on and so forth. So we are constantly under pressure, if not out and out prosecutions. Is there an impact on our community? Of course there is an impact on our community. Now the thing is, in Malaysia for many, many years, we had this wonderful law called the Internal Security Act, which means they could lock you up forever and ever, amen, without any trial. And that has been used before. In the past, we've had academics who were detained in the past. And for the longest time, we lived under a culture of fear. And it was a very, palpable culture of fear. And Malaysians, unlike our Southeast Asian neighbors, the Indonesians, the Thais, we're kind of wimpy. Yeah, we're kind of soft and wimpy. We're not very pugilistic. We're not fighters. So it's not that difficult to scare us. And we were scared for many, many years. But in the past 10 years or so, there appeared to be an opening up of the democratic space. And there was definitely a growing sense of entitlement to criticize, to voice our opinion. But in the past 4 years, the government has really clamped down hard on us. And it shows. For an example, it used to be thought that only academics who push themselves out in the public eye by giving public lectures, by writing the newspapers, etc. It's only these chaps who were in danger because you were obvious, you were out there. But those who did just pure academic work were somehow immune. Partly because I don't think our government reads the academic journals. I don't think they have the patience nor the intelligence to go through our academic journals. So, whatever you say, it doesn't get through them. But if you write in the newspapers, then they take notice. So I think that was the kind of general thinking in the past. If you push yourself out in the public eye, then you're at risk. But if you just keep yourself within academia, then you're not. But I think that's now, the concern now, the fear now, is seeping even into our normal academic endeavor, where people are censoring themselves even when they're writing for purely academic journals or purely academic works and books, etc. So definitely there is an effect there. What about our status as academics? Does it help us? Does it not help us? Well, I think it's a bit of both. Taking my case again as an example, and forgive me, on the one hand, the fact that I was an academic and I was not a politician and I was not an activist, it struck the imagination of the public because they saw fundamentally an ordinary person getting done by this oppressive law. I've never been first in anything in my life, but I was the first academic to be charged under sedition in Malaysia, so I'm quite proud of that. But the fact that it happened to a teacher basically really struck the public imagination, and that made a difference. Because it's not some hot-headed activist or politician who's getting done. It was an ordinary person, a teacher. Yet, on the other hand, when my trial actually started, the investigating officer, when questioned as to why they were bringing this against me, he said it was because I was an academic that they were bringing this case against me. Because he said that being a law lecturer, people might be influenced by what he said. Therefore, if I was flipping burgers in McDonald's and I said exactly the same thing, it should be okay. You know, so, when you say, does the status of an academic, is it a pro, is it a con? I can't tell. I really can't tell. It seems to be both. Now, how can scholars at risk help? How much time do I have? Thank you. Yeah, and that's about all I have. So, right. Of course, scholars at risk and, what scholars at risk is doing now is absolutely vital. The fact that you have, if you are aware of scholars at risk and you're aware that there's a safety net, it's a great comfort. And they have to just keep on doing what they are doing. But what I want to point out here is that a lot of the repression which happens at least in Southeast Asia, at least in Malaysia, it's not necessarily the state which is doing it. It's not necessarily the government. The universities themselves are complicit in this. The universities themselves are the ones who do not defend us when we are in trouble. The universities are the ones who stop our lectures, who stop our seminars when we try to organize things, who bar people from coming into our campus. Yet it is these same universities who have the aspiration of being top 100 universities in the world. Hit them where it hurts. Make it a criteria that if you want to be ranked by international standards, then academic freedom is one of the criteria with which you have to be judged. In which case, I can guarantee you, most universities in Southeast Asia would fail miserably, and all their dreams about being world-class universities will come crashing down, and serve them right. And that's one thing we can do, which we can hurt them in the medium term. Make it part of the criteria that academic freedom also equates to academic excellence. A lot of Southeast Asian universities also partner Western universities. And forgive me for using such a generalized term. Universities in Europe, universities in North America, they partner them. Are these partners aware that their partners in the Far East are doing these things? I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe they should be made aware. Now, I said I had a very nice lunch, and that's an understatement. It was with a classmate of mine from LLM, my LLM years, my master's years, and we haven't seen each other for 25 years. Yes, I know, I don't look that old, thank you. And we both said that was probably the best year of our lives. Now, the reason I raise this is, why are we doing this? Why do I care? There are two reasons why I care. Firstly, I'm embarrassed by the fact that my colleagues and friends from Syria, from Iran, from Turkey suffer so much more than what happens in my country. Like I was telling our group on Tuesday, the problems which are faced by my colleagues, it's like hard stuff. It's like heavy metal music, but the problems faced by Malaysia is like Justin Bieber. It really is no comparison. But nonetheless, ultimately, when we're talking about the problems that are faced in the world, some are urgent. It has to be solved now. People are under threat. Their lives are under threat. But ultimately, we are trying to make universities places where humanity can move forward. And that is important even in countries where the threat is extremely dangerous and extremely real, and in countries where it's like a Justin Bieber kind of thing. It applies to all of us. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, to push forward the development of humanity. That's one thing which I think is in my head whenever I feel embarrassed that, my country isn't so bad. But another thing is that, it reminds me of me and my mate. We had a really good time being students together, and I think everybody should have that opportunity too. Thank you very much.